Hello and welcome everyone to the daily news and editorial analysis of the Hindu newspaper of 11th of 7 September 2023। तो आज की इम्पोर्टेंट आर्टिकल देखने से पहले से ही शुरू करते हैं एक यूपीएससी प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चन पेपर सॉल्विंग से। तो क्वेश्चन क्या है? क्वेश्चन है ये कंसीडर द फॉलोइंग स्टेटमेंट्स। इस स्टेटमेंट को देखना है। तीन जो स्टेटमेंट दिया हुआ है। झेलम रिवर passes through Ulna Lake. Krishna River directly feeds Kuleraru Lake. Meandering of Gandak River from formed Kanwar Lake. तो पूछा क्या है? How many of the statements given above are correct? Only one, only two, only all the above, and last one is none. So इसका ये जो क्वेश्चन का आंसर है आप लोग कमेंट में दे सकते हैं और इसका एक्सप्लेनेशन और राइट आंसर जो है हम लोग वीडियो के एंड में ही डिस्कस करेंगे। ठीक है, तो चलिए आज की इम्पोर्टेंट आर्टिकल आज के लिए देख लेते हैं। ये वाला क्वेश्चन जो है ये आप सब लोग सॉल्व करके कमेंट सेक्शन में बता सकते हैं। तो चलिए देख लेते हैं आज का इम्पोर्टेंट आर्टिकल्स जो है द हिंदू न्यूज़पेपर से। पहला जो है Summit concludes, Modi calls for virtual review meet now. पेज नंबर 1 का ये है। Morocco quake, toll rises above 2100, all Hauj provinces suffer most death. पेज 1। Then stock taking calamity, ये एडिटोरियल का पोर्शन है। The larger project of subverting the idea of India, पेज नंबर 6। Secure and fair, ये भी पेज नंबर 6 का ही है। देन 7 का है रीडबल एफर्ट्स टू रिड्यूस डिजास्टर रिस्क्स। रशियन फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर प्रेजेस इंडिया फॉर समिट स्टेटमेंट सक्सेस। रशियन फॉरेन अफेयर मिनिस्टर प्रेजेस इंडिया फॉर समिट स्टेटमेंट सक्सेस। देन AU लीडर्स वेलकम admission into G20. Then Japan keen to deepen defense ties with India, says Fumio Kishida. Then on the crime of false promise to marry, as G20 plans to explore crypto regulation, India may wait to firm up domestic laws. Apple country gets ground ready for cannabis cultivation. Then regulator issues alert over sale of falsified version of 2 drugs. Aditya L1 completes another step in its journey towards sun. Then the last जो है genetic engineering gives mosquito control an upgrade. तो चलिए देख लेते हैं one by one. Summit concludes, Modi calls for virtual review meet in November. New Delhi Declaration, African Union membership among high points of the event. PM hands over the ceremonial gavel to President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva as Brazil is set to take over the next G20 presidency. He holds meeting with visiting leaders. तो नेक्स्ट जो प्रेसिडेंसी होगा वो ब्राजील का होगा, इसलिए प्राइम मिनिस्टर नरेंद्र मोदी उन्हें जो सेरेमोनियल गेवल वो हैंड ओवर कर रहे हैं इसमें से। The G20 under the Indian presidency should convene virtually towards November end to take stock of the progress made on the proposal received during the September 9-10 summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said here on Sunday, Mr. Modi handed over the ceremonial gavel to Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, initiating the process of transition of the president's chair for the next round of G20 in Brazil. In these 2 days, all of you have put forth many things, given suggestions that have come forward to see how their progress can be accelerated. I propose that we hold another virtual session of the G20 summit at the end of November. Mr. Modi said, expressing hope that the goals of the G20 will be further advanced during the upcoming presidency of Brazil. The virtual meeting will be held at the end of the Indian presidency in November. The Delhi summit witnessed a high point with the admission of the African Union as a new G20 member. This was followed by a personal announcement by Prime Minister Modi on the joint declaration of the summit, which was adopted through consensus, overcoming sharp differences among members regarding the Ukraine crisis. Soon after he declared the end of the summit, Mr. Modi held a series of meetings with the visiting leaders that included German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, President Lula da Silva, President of European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. After meeting President Erdogan, Mr. Modi said, we talked about ways to further cement a trade and infrastructure linkage between India and Turkey. Regarding the discussion at the summit in the last session, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said the agenda included digitization and artificial intelligence. It's crucial that we join together at international level to adopt rules on this so that this technology can be used safely and inclusively in our society. A working session that I took part in was devoted to ensuring that this process runs smoothly, Mr. Rutte said. Mr. Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron held a bilateral meeting over lunch, after which a joint statement was issued to inform that India and France will collaborate in the Indo-Pacific and in Africa in areas such as infrastructure, connectivity, energy, biodiversity, sustainability, and industrial projects. Both President Erdogan and President Macron addressed press conference in the media halls and assured assistance through the earthquake hit Morocco. Mr. Macron reiterated the call for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the United Nations Charter. He also called for deep reform of the global governance structure, including the United Nations worldwide and the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Macron and Mr. Erdogan appreciated the launch of the India Middle East European Union transport corridor that will include a network of roads, ports, and maritime routes. Mr. Erdogan, on his part, added that the transport initiative will gain by involvement of Iraq. Following the meeting with President Ajali Assoumani of Comoros, who became the first chairperson of African Union to sit at a G20 summit after the African Union was formally inducted into the organization on Saturday. Mr. Modi said Comoros was important for India's maritime vision, Sagar security and growth for all in the region. He said they discussed ways to enhance cooperation in areas like shipping, trade, and more. At the end of the summit, Mr. Modi greeted the media personnel at the media hall located a little away from the main venue of summit. Earlier in the day, the leaders visited Rajghat and paid a tribute to memory of Mahatma Gandhi. Then next, quake. Morocco quake toll rises above 2100. All house provinces suffer most deaths. Moroccans on Sunday mourned the victims of a devastating earthquake that killed more than 2,100 people as rescue team raced to find survivors trapped under the rubble of flattened villages. The strongest ever earthquake recorded in the North African country has killed at least 2,122 people and injured over 2,400. Friday's 6.8 magnitude quake struck 72 kilometers southwest of the tourist hub of Marrakech, wiping out entire village in the hills of the Atlas mountain range. Emergency services scrambled to reach remote mountain villages where victims were still feared trapped under the rubble of houses. All House province site of the epicenter suffered the most deaths with 1351. Everyone lost family. Everyone lost family. Bautra, another resident of Maule, Brahim, died her tears with her scarf as she watched men wielding pickaxes to dig graves for the victims. My cousin's grandchildren are dead, she said. I saw the devastation of the earthquake live and I am still shaking. Everyone here has lost family, whether in our village or elsewhere in the region. Many residents of the usually bustling tourist hotspot of Marrakech spent a second night sleeping out on the street, huddled together under blankets and among bags filled with their belongings. Fatima Satir, a Marrakech resident, said many were sleeping in the street for fear of their houses collapsing. The Red Cross warned that it could take years to repair the damage. The quake was the deadliest in Morocco since a 1960 earthquake destroyed Agadir and killed more than 12,000 people. The next है stock taking calamity and secure and fair. ये दोनों जो है एडिटोरियल का पर्सन है, देख लेते हैं. The world needs genuine breakthroughs in climate talks. The climate crisis intricately wove itself into the G20 summit in Delhi, particularly during the discussion on clean energy, sustainable development, and the collective responsibility necessary to avert it. The United Nations Global Stocktake, a report that was released just ahead of the G20 meet, set out the scope of challenges that awaited the major economies of the world, even as it presented little beyond what is already known. This stocktake is to serve as a temple to guide discussion ahead of the 20th Conference of Parties scheduled in Dubai this November, and is meant to be an official reckoning of the work actually done by countries since 2015 in stemming greenhouse gas emissions. That year, signatories to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change agreed in Paris to keep global emissions from rising beyond 2 degrees centigrade and, as far as possible, limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Though it acknowledges some headway, the world as of now is emitting gases in a manner that will certainly overshoot the Paris Agreement limit. The report unequivocally states that much more ambition in actions and support is necessary for implementing domestic mitigation measures to reduce global greenhouse gases emissions by 43% by 2030, 60% by 2035, and reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 globally. Based on current information submitted by countries, The emission gap consistent with 1.5 degrees centigrade in 2030 is estimated to be 20.3 billion tons and 23.9 billion tons of CO2. These are gaps unlikely to be filled without a rapid upscaling of renewable energy resources and an essential of fossil fuel sources such as coal, oil, and natural gas. However, despite several acknowledgements by world leaders, most recently at the G20 of a magnitude of the crisis, little has been achieved in terms of energy transition. G20 countries account for 93% of global operating coal power plants and 88% of prospective ones. The G20 leaders' declaration formally recognized the need for 5.8 to 5.9 trillion US dollar in the pre-2030 period required for developing countries, as well as 4 trillion US dollar per year for clean energy technology by 2030 to reach net zero by 2050. The report also dwells on the need to reverse deforestation and the adoption of electric vehicles as vital prawns to a clean energy economy. However, it does not single out individual countries or provide a more granular analysis of where the existing shortcomings are in the approach adopted by countries to curtail emissions. The Stocktake report, however, must not be dismissed as yet another technical document. During the upcoming climate talks, it must form the basis of negotiation to aid the discovery and adoption of genuine breakthroughs. Secure and fair efforts to regulate unfair online trade practices were overdue. India's efforts to regulate insidious e-commerce trade practices known as dark pattern are a welcome step and long overdue. The government's consultation with sector stakeholders and consumer advocacy groups, culminating with the draft guidelines to prevent and regulate dark patterns. Public comments have been sought by over October 5. It is hoped generate the much needed attention this issue deserves. When the British user experience researcher Harry Brignall coined the term dark patterns in 2010, Google, now Alphabet, was considered a winning search engine, and Facebook, now Meta, enabled long lost connection and unprecedented access into personal life even when people lived oceans apart. Dark patterns of the profit making had emerged, but consumer awarenesses about the consequences to privacy and time, energy, and money spent was unclear. Examples of dark patterns that have since become ubiquitous include the auto checkmark for travel insurance while booking flight tickets, the mandatory requirements for entering emails or phone numbers to access e-commerce sites, which are then used to send text messages or emails that become difficult to block, or birthday wishes that nudges users to buy themselves a gift. With greater awareness about the surplus profit-making methods of online e-commerce, government are scrambling to regulate this sector and its trade practices. Last March, the European Data Protection Board issued guidelines on how to recognize and avoid dark patterns on social media platforms, and the United States Federal Trade Commission last September warned of a rise of sophisticated dark patterns designed to trick and trap consumers. The guidelines in India detail ways to identify and prevent false urgency, basket sneaking, confirm shaming, forced actions, and a subscription trap by online platforms. An advertising standard council of India report in 2021 estimated that over 50% of e-commerce sites used dark patterns to sell their products. Now, in what is truly The era of fourth industrial revolution, net technology giants have systematically collected the behavioral footprint of digital users to sell their or third-party products and amassed profit that are often larger than the gross domestic product of several nations combined. India's efforts so far to regulate the sector have been confined to preventing tax leakage and protecting the interest of brick and mortar merchants. The newfound focus on consumer along with the wider view of the need to safeguard privacy in relation to personal data on e-commerce site and social media platform should boost user confidence and ensure a safe, secure, free and fair digital environment. So next है the larger project of subverting the idea of India. The larger project of subverting the idea of India. It would be dangerous to dismiss the fresh impetus to introduce simultaneous election to the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies and as yet another gimmick in the run-up to next general election scheduled for 2024. While several committees since 1999 have examined the proposal to the push to introduce and make permanent simultaneous polls once every 5 years has come over the past decade, with Prime Minister Modi often speaking about its desirability. This, however, is perhaps the first time that a high-level committee is headed by a former president of India, a most unusual appointment that is meant to impose a stamp of legitimacy on the recommendation. The selling of a simplistic idea and the truth of all the one India decision taken by the Union government since 2014. This proposal is the most important. If carried through, it will further centralize power in New Delhi, strengthen the hold of national parties when in office, and reduce the importance of regional parties. This is the immediate political purpose behind putting in place and codifying a system of simultaneous poll. The idea is being sold under the grab of saving expenditure and avoiding the disruption of administration during elections. The argument that elections somewhere in the country throughout the year disrupt hard work and good governance and are an expense we can ill afford in a simplistic one, it yet appeals to a section of an electorate that is unhappy with bureaucratic and insensitive governance. However, there has been a substantial body of analysis by independent commentators pointing out both the false rationale for and negative implications of introducing such a system. The burden of government expenditure on elections is not so large as to warrant such a change. The model code of conduct need not come in the way of governance ahead of election. Governance does indeed become affected when elections happen to be held in one state or the other every year, but this is only when the party holding office in New Delhi is forever in an election mode, when the ruling party or coalition at the center refuses to take national decisions, fearing what impact it will have in one state or the other. Then governance is disrupted, and it becomes an even bigger problem when the ruling party sees every election from a municipal election upward as a must-win poll, and all its senior functionaries spent as much time on campaigning as on governance. As Y.V. Reddy, the chairman of the 14th Finance Commission, pointed out 5 years ago in a wide-ranging discussion of this idea, elections are meant to hold governments accountable for their record of governance, and yet when they turn out to be frequent, they are being faulted for disrupting governance. An argument made in favor of legally mandating simultaneous polls draws on evidence from one study conducted of voting percentages between 1971 and 2004, which showed that voter turnout in the states is lowest when assembly elections are held separately from those to the Lok Sabha. But this argument is only a rationalization for the simultaneous poll idea. A higher voter participation is to be welcomed, but it should be increased through other means rather than with a set of measures that will turn parts of the constitution upside down. A number of scholars and commentators have also pointed out that one way or the other major constitutional changes will need to be made to the constitutional terms of legislature and rules for unseating a government. After the first round of curtailing, extending the tenure of elected state government, making simultaneous polls a permanent feature will require either fixed term governments or to end of no confidence motion or supermajority to unseat government or greater powers in the hands of the president or governors or a combination of such drastic changes. The alteration will in effect change of the basic structure of the constitution. All of this will reduce the importance of state governments will the idea of federalism being given a body blow. There will be a corresponding concentration of power in New Delhi. A project to wipe out the diversity, the entire one nation, one X agenda is part of the political project with the message that only one government, one political party, and one leader can deliver and will transform India. The steady expansion over the years of union government into the state's domain in providing social and economic services. The intolerance of the Bharatiya Janata Party towards any political party unless it is a supporter and the multidimensional projection of the Prime Minister as a leader who will change India as no one has before are part of this political project. There is the larger, well-known ideological agenda of denying India its strength in heterogeneity. It is instead a complete homogeneity that is valued one nation with one dominant religion and one dominant language, if not one nation with one religion and one language, where earlier the unifying messages was unity in diversity in this land of heterogeneous people, communities, tradition and languages. The aim the aim now is to impose a unity with a oneness, a stamp of homogeneity to wipe out the unique Indian character of diversity. This will not be an easy task to accomplish even for a political formation with a 100-year-old ideological program to turn one of the current slogan on its head. The character of civilization with some thousands of years of history cannot be changed during a few terms of a government, however brute its majority in parliament. This will not be for want of trying through, though the one nation in one election agenda goes much further than one nation, one tax, one ration card, and the like. In imposing this oneness, if implemented, it will permanently increase multifold the administrative and political centralization of power in the hands of a union government and corresponding weaken the states. We have been in the midst of the fortnight of frenetic political activity. A special session of parliament has been convened by a government which has still not laid out its agenda. This will be an unusual sitting convened by a government which is otherwise only interested in remaining, though through legislation without debate. We have had the noise about Bharat and whether henceforth the country will be officially called only Bharat as not as now India and Bharat. All this on the top of the new push for holding simultaneous polls which has been bandied about since 2014. When and what will the high level committee on simultaneous poll recommended? We do not have to guess what a committee that has been given a set of made to order terms of reference and seems to be packed with the king's men will come up with. The lone member from the opposition had little opinion but to opt out of a committee that was suddenly announced without any prior consultation. The last word. How do we deal with such a proposed subversion of the constitution, a parliament that has been neutralized, a judiciary that is supine, a media that is largely subservient, and a civil society that has been emasculated with not be able to resist the government's plan. It is only the electorate that now has the power to decide if they want to live with this particular idea of one India. Then पेज नंबर 7 का जो आर्टिकल है रीडबल एफर्ट्स टू रिड्यूस डिजास्टर रिस्क. As leaders underscore at the G20 summit in New Delhi yesterday, ahead of United Nations General Assembly SDG Sustainable Development Goals Summit in New York next week, the world stands at a critical juncture. Risks are being created faster than they are being reduced. The aftershock of the COVID-19 pandemic combined with a polycrisis of war, debt, and food insecurity and are putting our collective ability to cope to the test, and all against the backdrop of a climate crisis driving the extreme weather events that are occurring more frequently and with the greater intensity. The rise in disaster is a trend, not an aberration. Headlines in this year alone have brought a relentless wave of bad news across the world, from severe flooding in the China to destructive wildfires in Europe and Hawaii to the hottest month ever on record in July. This is set to become the new normal if more action is not taken. And preservedly, it is the most vulnerable countries and communities which are paying the greatest price despite having contributed least to the problem. The majority of the 50 countries most vulnerable to climate change and also suffer from severe debt issues. India, already among the world's most disaster prone countries, is experiencing this new reality acutely. In 2022, the country was battered by disaster or extreme weather nearly every day, while this year's severe monsoon has caused widespread loss of livelihood and lives. We have the solution at the hand, yet there is also good news. First, we have the solution for both adaptation and mitigation at hand. The SDGs remain our best blueprint for peace and prosperity, together with commitments made in Paris to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and global framework for reducing disaster risk, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. 8 years into the implementation of the Sendai framework, the progress is severely lacking. However, in May this year, United Nations member states committed to accelerate resilience building with renewed and urgency. Many lessons are being learned from COVID-19 pandemic, including on the importance of system-wide disaster risk reduction, resilience, and adaptation. The crisis not only revealed our vulnerability to risk but also forged new ways of working together, including through digital innovations such as computer modeling and India's co-in digital vaccine system. Another reason for optimism is India's stewardship on disaster risk reduction. All the 28 states have prepared their own disaster management plans in recent years. Accordingly, mortality from extreme weather events has fallen drastically in the recent years. India's early warning system for cyclones covers the entire coastline and has helped reduce cyclone related mortality by 90% over the last 15 years, while heat wave action plans at the local level have reduced heat waves deaths by over 90%. The recent zero-death toll of Cyclone Biparjoy in Gujarat demonstrates what can be achieved through effective preparedness, response, and early warning and action system. In fact, there were rays of joy amidst the disaster as hundreds of babies were reported to have been born to women who had been transported to hospital and shelter for the safe delivery by the government before the cyclone. The 15th Finance Commission in India introduced significant reforms to disaster risk financing with a total allocation of $28.6 billion at the national and state level for a period of 5 years. The government of India has provided sufficient resources for disaster preparedness, response, recovery, and capacity development on the international stage. India is promoting disaster resilience and sustainability, including through the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, a global partnership for building resilience in infrastructure. India's National Disaster Response Force responds to domestic disaster and is also regularly deployed to disaster zones around the world. Importantly, India's ongoing G20 presidency established the first ever work stem on disaster risk reduction. The disaster risk reduction working group is aligned with the SDGs and reflects many of our shared priorities. The transformation we need, disaster risk must be integrated at all levels into how we build, how we invest, and how we live. One of the most cost-effective risk reduction methods in it is early warning system of for all, spearheaded by the United Nations with India's support. Just a 24-hour warning of a coming storm can reduce the damage caused by 30%. Yet over a third of the world's population, mostly in least developed countries and small island developing states, do not have access to such systems. The ultimate goal is a global multi-risk warning system for all kinds of hazards, whether biological, tectonics, or technological improvement. Improving global data capabilities will help us predict and respond to the risk if we are facing. We commend India's G20 presidency for its progress on knowledge sharing, joint data infrastructure, and risk analysis. Finally, we need to ensure that no one is left behind. We must enhance international cooperation in disaster prevention, response, and recovery, especially for the countries of the global south. The G20 summit and the outcomes of the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group are an opportunity to design a future where we are equipped to withstand disaster risk. As United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, extreme weather events will happen, but they do not need to become deadly disaster. Then next we have Russian Foreign Affairs Minister praises India for summit statement success. G7 and European Union countries were made to compromise on Ukraine language by developing countries, says Lavrov at a press conference full of barbs about the West. He praises Global South for being able to uphold their legitimate interest. Praising the New Delhi Declaration as a milestone for G20 process, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the summit hosted by India had prevented Western countries from making the Ukraine conflict the center point of its agenda. While Mr. Lavrov denied any change to military and technological supplies to India due to the conflict, including the delivery of S-400 missile system to India, he said that India has promised Russia new avenues of investment so that the billions of rupees now lying in trade surpluses with India can be utilized. Fair outcomes, he said India had been instrumental in achieving a fair outcomes at the summit and presented the summit statement as a diplomatic win for Russia. The text does not mention Russia at all, Mr. Lavrov said, adding that the Ukrainian crisis is mentioned but only in the context of need to settle all conflicts in the world in accordance with the United Nations Charter. In the eighth paragraph on geopolitical issues in New Delhi Declaration issued on Saturday, the only direct mention of Russia are with regard to reviving the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a major shift from the Bali G20 statement where the Russia's actions in Ukraine were severely criticized. Mr. Lavrov said that he had not expected the outcome but seemed clearly pleased with it. Compromise solution in a press conference full of barbs about the G7 and EU, which he repeatedly referred to as the West. Mr. Lavrov said that all G20 declarations need a compromise. It is good that Western countries agreed to compromise, he added. Perhaps it was the voice of their conscience, he said, when asked why he thought the G7 and European Union had agreed to shift after remaining adamant on the Bali paragraph for months, adding that the summit marked the awakening of the Global South members of G20. Our BRICS partner Brazil, India, China, and South Africa have been particularly active, and thanks to this consolidated position, the Global South has been able to protect and uphold their legitimate interests, and the West has been unable to Ukrainize the agenda to detriment of the discussion for developing countries, Mr. Lavrov told reporters in a press conference after the summit ended, giving the most credit to India for its role in uniting the global south. Mr. Lavrov sidestepped a question about whether Prime Minister Narendra Modi had also spoken to President Vladimir Putin to affect the breakthrough in G20 negotiations, but said that while Sherpas negotiated the language, they took political guidance if they faced obstacles. He also pointed to his meeting with External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar in Indonesia last week on the sidelines of ASEAN and East Asia Summit and said the two ministers had been able to discuss many bilateral and multilateral issues. Payment modes chief among the bilateral issues has been the development of payment mechanism that would allow the two countries to fully utilize payment made in national currencies in order to sidestep US and European Union sanctions on Russian trade after its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Our Indian friends said they would propose promising areas they can be invested in. Right now, our government are talking how to use and invest them to mutual benefit. He said in response to a question from the Hindu. However, he denied that India-Russia military and technical ties were facing any problem and said that the S-400 Triumph anti-aircraft missile system deal is proceeding on schedule. Then next है AU leaders welcome admission into G20. African leaders welcomed the unanimous decision by the G20 countries to admit the African Union as its 21st member, honored to welcome the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 family. This will strengthen the G20 and also strengthen the voice of the Global South. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said on Saturday he embraced Comoros President Azali Assoumani, who is also the chairperson of the African Union, and invited him to join the proceedings at the summit in New Delhi. African leaders affirmed Mr. Modi's view in their reaction to the inclusion of African Union. We are delighted that the G20 has accepted the African Union as a member of the G20 global reconstruction in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic presents a unique opportunity to accelerate the transition to low carbon, climate resilient, sustainable societies, Mr. Ramaphosa said in a post on X. Then next जो है जापान keen to deepen defense ties with India says Kishida. Japan Prime Minister refers to the harsh security environment in the region and says the country is opposed to unilateral changes to the status quo in East and South China Sea. He defends the Delhi declarations as a meaningful achievement. Japan sees India as an indispensable partner in the Indo-Pacific and is keen to develop deeper defense cooperation to ensure maritime security in the region, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida said on Sunday. Our self-defense forces and the Indian Armed Forces have already conducted joint exercises this year between all services of land, sea and air. Our cooperative relationship is deepening steadily, Mr. Kishida said to a question from the Hindu on India's role in his new free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. For example, as we did last year, our maritime self-defense forces and the Indian Navy engaged in joint exercise in this July, and the Japan, Australia, India, US Quad joint drill Malabar was also held on a continuous basis. So going forward, to ensure the Indo-Pacific will not be a region that will be decided by force and will be a region that values freedom and rule of law, we will continue active defense cooperation and exchanges with India. Mr. Kishida stressed that Japan's FOIP was an inclusive and open concept and has no specific country in mind, security and environment. At the same time, he described an increasingly harsh security environment in the region and said Japan was opposed to unilateral changes to the status quo in East and South China Sea, and also firmly condemned North Korea's missile activities. The FOIP that Japan is promoting is a concept to uphold and reinforce a free and open international order based on rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region, and by doing so, we aim to ensure peace and stability and prosperity in the entire region and ultimately across the world. That is the vision. Mr. Kishida had announced his new FOIP plan during a visit to India in March this year. As a concrete measure, we announced the reinforcement of our support to maritime law enforcement capabilities and for maritime security. He said, in particular, India is an indispensable partner to realize a FOIP. Mr. Kishida defended the G20 New Delhi Declaration as a meaningful achievement when asked about the absence of a reference to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which was mentioned in last year's Bali Declaration, but warned it was shaking the foundation of the G20. Russian invasion today as the world faces complex crisis. Collaboration at G20 as premier forum for economic cooperation is becoming increasingly important. Russia's aggression of Ukraine is shaking the very foundation of cooperation at G20. It could shake the basis of cooperation at G20 further. It is causing enormous impact to the world economy through such factors such as pro- protected rise of food and energy prices, he said. At the same time, he said the fact that the declaration was adopted along with support of Russia is very meaningful. There are various comments such as this being a weak declaration without explicit condemnation, he said. Even in comparison to the Bali declaration, we have applied new expressions. For example, the call for refraining from the use or threat of use of force to seek territorial acquisitions on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Throughout the meetings, Japan has praised for immediate withdrawal of Russian troops and realization of a just durable peace in Ukraine. We underscored our position that Russia's nuclear threat, let alone use of a nuclear weapon, is absolutely unacceptable. We also highlighted the importance of assistance by the global community to vulnerable populations under conflict, he added, which was mentioned in the declarations. Then next on the crimes of a false promise to marry. If a man promises to marry a woman but never intends to and still has consensual sex with her, it will amount to a criminal offence under Section 69 of a proposed Bharatiya Nyaya Samhita 2023. The bill, which seeks to replace the Indian Penal Code 1860 identifies sexual intercourse on false promise of marriage as an offense. At present, the offense is not carved out separately in the IPC, but courts have dealt with similar cases through other provisions within the criminal law framework. What does Section 69 say? Chapter 5 of the bill, titled Offences Against Women and Children, describes sexual intercourse by employing deceitful means, etc. Section 69 creates two violations, one by deceitful means and one by a false promise to marry. Deceitful means you will include the prom- false promise of employment or promotion, inducement of or marrying after suppressing identity. The false promise to marry will be attracted only when a man makes a promise to marry a woman with the intention of breaking it for the purpose of getting her consent and sexually exploiting her. Both offences will extract a penalty of up to 10 years of imprisonment. While introducing the bills, Home Minister Amit Shah said crime against women and many social problems faced by them have been addressed in this bill. For the first time, intercourse with women under the false promise of marriage, employment, promotion, and false identity will amount to a crime. How has the IPC dealt with the cases of a false promise to marry? In 2016, a quarter of the total rape cases registered in the Delhi pertained to sex under false promise of marriage. As per Delhi police data, the National Crime Records Bureau in the same year recorded 10,068 similar cases of rape by unknown persons on a promise to marry the victims. The number was 7,655 in 2015. Researchers Nikita Sunabhan and Nikita Biswanath explained the explained that these cases happened in one of 2 days when rape is committed and the promise of marriage is used to silence the victim, or where the promise is made to convince the person into entering a sexual relationship. Activists note that such cases plays out mostly among socially disadvantaged women, given that legal remedy cannot be easily sought. BNS penalizes those coercing women into sexual relationship. Previously, these cases were dealt with through a joint reading of Section 375 and 90 of the IPC. Section 375, which defines rape, further defines consent as an unequivocal voluntary agreement when the woman by words, gesture, or any form of verbal or non-verbal communication communicates a willingness to participate in the specific sexual act. Explanation 2 of Section 375 also lists 7 types of consent which would amount to rape if violated. These include if a man has sexual intercourse with a woman without her consent, or consent taken through fear of death, hurt or intoxication. In 2021, the Supreme Court reiterated that under Section 375, a woman's consent must involve an active and reasoned deliberation towards the proposed act. Section 90 says consent given under fear of injury or misconception of fact cannot be considered as consent. Cases for false promise to marry are dealt with under the latter, where a misconception is used to access the validity of consent. Legal scholars have questioned the use of Section 90 to interpret consent, given that Section 375 already lays out a definition. What is the difference between false promise and breach of promise? The law has been the law has distinguished between a false promise and breach of promise on the basis of proving if a man intended to marry at the time of engaging in sex. Courts have previously recognized the ambiguity in determining consent and intention. In such cases, the Supreme Court observed that a false promise is given on the understanding by its maker that it will be broken, but a breach of a promise is made in good faith but subsequently not fulfilled. Put simply, if a man can prove he intended to marry the woman before he entered into a sexual relationship but later is unable to due to whatever reason, it is not legally punishable. The Supreme Court in 2022 held that consensual sex on a genuine promise of marriage does not constitute rape. The court in such cases must very carefully examine whether the complainant had actually wanted to marry the victim or had malafide motives and had made a false promise to this effect only to satisfy his lust, as the latter falls within the ambit of cheating or deception. The Supreme Court said, how is intention to marry proved? Cases of false promise of marriage look at two central issues: how consent is obtained through the deceitful means or by misconception, and whether the man ever intended to marry the woman. The Supreme Court this year said every breach of promise is not rape, noting one cannot deny a possibility that the accused might have given a promise with all seriousness to marry her and subsequently might have encountered certain circumstances unforeseen by him or the circumstances beyond his control which prevented him. But activists argue that circumstances are shorthand for social norms that uphold the status quo, reinforcing gender roles, patriarchy and caste lines. Moreover, Section 69 in the BNS codifies the offence instead of creating a new one. Thus, in its present form, the bill does not dissolve the confused distinction between the false promise and breach of promise and overlooks the inherent limitation in criminal laws, which feminist and anti-caste activists has pointed out. Lawyer Surbi Karwa stated in an article, there are two critiques that may spill over Section 69 if one scrutinized one. As a scholar like Nivedita Menon have argued, is that such application promotes restrictive ideas about women marriage and consent. They hinder women's anatomy and victimize them. Courts have previously relied on a woman's age, sexual history, and marital status to question their ability to trust the promise of marriage. If a fully grown up lady consents to the act of sexual intercourse on a promise to marry and continues to indulge in a such activity for long, it is an act of promiscuity of her part and not an act induced by the misconception of fact. As the Delhi High Court ruled in a case, activists note that these train a victim blaming lens on the issue and shift the burden to women to prove their consent was vit- vitiated. The vagueness and discretionary nature of ruling up often power the narrative that these are the instances of love gone sour. In 2017, Justice Pratibha Rani of the Delhi High Court, taking umbrage at the rising number of such cases, implied that women use rape laws as vendetta. She stated, on a number of occasions where both persons out of their own will and choice develop consensual physical relationship, and when the relationship breaks up due to some reason, the women use the law as a weapon for vengeance and personal vendetta. Similarly, in the August 21 cases, the Supreme Court bench of Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul and Sudhanshu Dhulia remarked, on a false pretext of a marriage case, so far as it is consensual and between adults, there is no problem. But when you choose to live by your own standards, you should also be ready to face all the possible consequences. However, feminist scholars have reiterated that rape law is often the only resource available to women to seek damages or maintenance. Two, the law promotes endogamy and shifts the conversation away from the real harm and abuse that women face. As researcher Nikita Sonabhan has pointed out, Mr. Sonabhan in a paper looked at false promise on marriage rape judgments passed by a district court in Chhattisgarh where the prosecutives belonging to a scheduled caste took recourse under Section 376 and Section 90 of IPC. Her findings showed impossibility of an intercaste marriage was also used as a ground to acquit the accused of rape. The court is in fact upholding the archaic practices of marrying within one's own caste. The judgment in Uday versus State of Karnataka became the basis of several future outcomes. A woman from an OBC caste accused a Brahmin man of raping and impregnating greeting her. The man promised to marry her but later negated on the promise. A Supreme Court bench ruled against the rape, saying there was no evidence to show a lack of intentions. Instead, since the parties belonged to different castes, the victim had to be clearly conscious of the stiff opposition the relationship would face, and was not a case of misconception. Mrs. Sonavan noted how this promotes endogamy and refined the institution of caste while also penalizing the prosecutors for not adhering to caste norms. Mr. Sonavan reimagined a feminist interpretation of this judgment which does not rely on character assassination of women, moves outside a binary idea of consent, and acknowledges the fraught social context in which women cooperate. Such cases would go beyond criminal law to offer reprieve to women through civil damages without clarity on justifiable intention. Commentators and the bill would empower a cycle where the consequences of a crime was specified but the consequences of harm which women bear are overlooked. As G20 plans as G20 plans to explore crypto regulations, India may wait to firm up domestic laws. With the G20 countries agreeing to explore a coordinated regulatory framework for crypto assets, India could wait a while longer before firming up its domestic regulations for cryptocurrencies and initiated dialogue with stakeholders on the way forward. And outright ban on cryptocurrencies that was mooted by the Reserve Bank of India under the consideration by the government is likely of the cards. A senior government official indicated on Sunday earlier India was contemplating a ban on it. A lot of conversation happened in late 2021. There was a lot of interest in cryptocurrencies. A lot of people were buying it, and even advertisement were coming in IPL matches, which we felt was not on the official recalled. When we went deeper into regulating it, we realized one country alone cannot do it unless we get into monitoring and controlling every device on the internet, which is not the kind of regulation we want in India. So, whatever we do all along, this thought has been there to build a global consensus. The official said the G20 leaders' declaration has endorsed the Friday Financial Stability Board recommendation to regulate and supervise crypto assets activities. It welcomed a synthesis paper for the International Monetary Fund and the FSB, which includes a roadmap for a coordinated regulatory framework that factors in risk, including those specific emerging markets and pertaining to money laundering and terror financing. Timely execution. The G20 finance minister and central governor will discuss taking forward this roadmap at a meeting in Marrakesh next month. Any country can allow higher risk if they want or ban it if they like, but whatever one does, it should not go below a certain level of regulations. Otherwise, it will lead to shifting of the trade to the other jurisdiction. The official pointed out, explaining the G20 push for timely implementation of AFSB recommendation in a consistent manner globally to avoid regulatory arbitrage. It has to be taken up not just by G20 countries but others as well. If one country says we will have a very relaxed approach towards it, It will defeat the entire purpose of the official, said IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva said on Sunday that more work lies ahead in the realm of digital money, crypto assets. Then Apple country gets round ground ready for cannabis cultivation. ये थोड़ा देख लेंगे आप लोग. Then regulator alert over sale of falsified version of drug. Then Aditya L1 completes another step in its journey towards Son. The Drug Controller General of India has directed the drug controllers of the state and union territories to keen a strict vigil on the sale and distribution of a falsified version of liver medication Difitelio and Takeda cancer drug and Adcetris injection following alerts issued by the World Health Organization in an advisory issued on September 5. The DCGI said the WHO has issued a safety alert identified with multiple falsified versions of Adcetris injection 50 mg manufactured by the Takeda Pharmaceutical Company Limited identified in 4 different countries including India. These products are most often available at the patient level and distributed in the unregulated supply chain, mainly online. The product has had been identified in both regulated and illicit supply chains, sometimes at patient level as well. WHO has reported that there are at least 8 different batch numbers of falsified version in circulation. The DCGI said in a communication to the state drug controller and Adcetris is a CD30 directed antibody drug conjugate indicated for the treatment of a patient with Hodgkin lymphoma after the failure of an autologous stem cell transplant and systematic anaplastic large cell lymphoma. On September 6, the DCGI issued another advisory referring to a safety alert issued by the WHO on September 4 for falsified product Defitelio 80 mg per ml concentrate for solution for inclusion manufactured by Gentium SRL. This falsified product has been detected in India April 2023 and Turkey July 2023 and was supplied outside of regulated and authorized channels. The WHO said the genuine manufacturer of Defitelio has confirmed that the product reference is the alert is falsified. Then Aditya L1 completes another step in its journey towards the Sun. The sorry, spacecraft undergoes the third Earthbound maneuver successfully, says ISRO. Two more maneuvers are scheduled on September 15 and 18. The third Earthbound maneuvers of Aditya L1 spacecraft, India's first space-based mission to study the Sun, was successfully performed in the early hours of Sunday. The Indian Space Research Organisation said the maneuvers was carried out by the Telemetry Tracking and Command Network ISTRAC is in Bangalore. The third earthbound maneuvers is performed successfully from the ISTRAC Bangalore ISRO's ground station at Mauritius. Bangalore SD, SHAR and Port Blair tracked the satellite during this operation. The ISRO posted on X. The new orbit attained is 296 km into 71767 km. The space agency said two more maneuvers are scheduled to take place. The next maneuver is scheduled for September 15, 2023 around 2 hours IST India Standard Time. It is said after the final maneuver on September 8, Aditya L1 will undergo a Trans-Lagrangian 1 insertion maneuver, marking the beginning of its 110-day trajectory to destination around the L1 Lagrange point. Upon arrival at the L1 point, another maneuver will bind Aditya L1 to an orbit around L1, a balanced gravitational location between the Earth and the Sun. Aditya L1 will stay approximately 1.5 million kilometers away from Earth, directed towards the Sun, which is about 1% of Earth-Sun distance. देन आज का जो लास्ट आर्टिकल है जेनेटिक इंजीनियरिंग गिव मॉस्किटो कंट्रोल एंड अपग्रेड. ये थोड़ा देख लेंगे आप लोग. नेक्स्ट जो हम लोग क्वेश्चन किए हुए थे, डिस्कस किए हुए थे, उसका क्या होगा आंसर. कंसिडर द फॉलोइंग स्टेटमेंट. झेलम रिवर पासेस थ्रू वुलन लेक. Then second statement was Krishna River directly feeds the Colorado Lake. Meandering of Gandak River formed Kanwar Lake. So question is how many of the statement given are correct. So here the answer is only two. Okay. So explanation is statement 1. The main source of water for Vollar Lake is River Jhelum. This lake also has a similar small island in its center called Jaina Lake. Statement 2 is incorrect. The Koleru Lake is a natural euphoric lake situated between the two major rivers basin of the Godavari and Krishna. Statement 3 is incorrect. The Kanwar Lake draws water from the confluence of Budhi Gandak. The Byas and Kareh river is situated near Majol, 22 km northwest Begusarai, Bihar. So this is all for today and we'll continue from tomorrow onwards. So thank you everyone.